Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, so thank you to Stig Erik and the organisers for having me in Oslo today. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I come from the University of Bath, and these are the Roman baths. This isn't my office. I wish it was, maybe one of these days, but we're famous in Bath for the Roman ruins. And this morning, in terms of the talks you've heard, I think there's been a really clear message from both talks that cannabis products have changed dramatically, especially over the last 5 to 10 years. One of the things that's really interested me is how changes in these products might impact on the health of the user, and especially when we think about young people. The other thing that's changed is that the science of the cannabis plant has really taken great steps forward. And so when we think about cannabis, it's not just one drug, it's a plant that contains many different drugs. And so when we think about the science of cannabis and cannabinoids, this could lead us to new innovations for treatment and harm reduction. So there are many names here. This is for good reason. This is not just my work. This is a group effort. So I'm very thankful to my colleagues who've worked with me on these projects. The work I'm presenting in this talk was funded by the Medical Research Council and the Society for the Study of Addiction. I've never accepted any money from industry, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So briefly, this is the structure of my talk. I'll start by talking about the cannabis plant and cannabinoids. I'll then go into the health effects of high-potency cannabis products. Leading on from that, I'll talk about potential harm reduction strategies that you might find useful when engaging with young people. And finally, I'll talk about CBD as a potential treatment for cannabis problems. So the cannabis plant really is a fascinating plant. It produces at least 144 cannabinoids. And a cannabinoid is a chemical that acts on the endocannabinoid system, which all mammals have. I'll get to more of that later. But the main two of interest are THC delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol and CBD or cannabidiol. Now, both THC and CBD are produced alongside the rest of the cannabinoids in these glandular trichomes. So you can see in this figure on the bottom, you can see a bulbous cell head. This is a glandular trichome, and so this is where we see cannabinoids are produced in the plant. And it's important to think about cannabinoids from the plant's perspective. The reason that they're produced is for reasons of defense. So both THC and CBD can protect the cannabis plant against the effects of UV light. So essentially, it's almost like a sunscreen for the cannabis plant. These cannabinoids are protecting them. The other thing is that these trichomes, they have sticky secretions. And so if an insect was to crawl on one of these trichomes, it would get stuck and it would die. So there's a twofold protection mechanism, both UV light and also the stickiness of these trichomes. And for this reason, because they are very protective, we see them in the most important part of the cannabis plant, which is these flowering tops of the female plants, the reproductive organs. And this is important because when we think about cannabis products, what people typically do, unsurprisingly, is that they take the cannabis flowers from female plants. This is the cannabis that young people use. And also, when we try to extract cannabis preparations to make them more potent, we're looking really at these trichomes, and we're looking, can we make cannabis extraction more efficient? And it's very much based on where cannabinoids are produced within these cells. One of the other interesting things about the cannabis plant and THC and CBD is that we see 3 main types of cannabis based on how much of each of these they produce. So most cannabis used recreationally is of the THC dominant form. You can see this here on the left. And so these plants produce just THC. They don't produce any CBD at all, just a very small amount. And not surprisingly, this kind of cannabis is more intoxicating, and so people tend to use this, it's more profitable, and it makes sense for people to use this form of cannabis for recreational use. You can also have the mixed Thc Cbd strains. These are quite a good strain in terms of safety because they produce modest amounts of THC and also modest amounts of CBD. So sometimes you will see this kind of cannabis recreationally, and sometimes in medicinal forms of cannabis. And finally, you have Cbd Dominant Cannabis, and this produces lots of CBD and a small amount of THC. So it's very rare to see this for recreational purposes because it won't be intoxicating. But at the same time, this is the kind of cannabis plant that's used to extract CBD preparations that you might see in the high street. So for example, CBD oils. These still have some THC in them. that's a risk of these products. As you can see from this graph, there is still some THC. But in general, cannabis falls into these three main themes. An important take-home message is that if your plant is producing a lot of CBD, it can't produce much THC and vice versa. It's a rate-limiting factor. So you can't produce lots of THC and lots of CBD at the same time. But we're also very interested in humans and in terms of the effects on the brain and mental health. And I mentioned previously that all mammals have an endocannabinoid system. This is very important for modulating lots of bodily processes, but especially I'm going to talk about psychiatric processes today. So what you can see from this figure on the right is an image of the brain with regions showing high levels of cannabinoid receptors. And so you can see the areas that have the darker blue, those are the regions that have a higher density of cannabinoid type 1 receptors. These include the hippocampus, which is very much involved in learning and memory. As we heard from Jonathan earlier, nobody takes THC to improve their cognition. We don't get any THC for chess players. There's a good reason for this. It really impairs your memory. It also impairs your planning, which is partly controlled by the prefrontal cortex. You can see here is very densely innervated by cannabinoid type 1 receptors. And we also see regions which are involved in reward and emotions, such as the basolateral amygdala. And this can account for the dependence-inducing effects of cannabis, as well as its effects on emotion. And now just looking at THC and CBD in terms of the effects they produce. These are dose-dependent, and THC most reliably produces intoxicating effects. So we know that people become stoned or high, and often they enjoy this, so this is a rewarding, intoxicating effect. But at the same time, sometimes people do experience anxiety and psychotic-like symptoms, especially from high doses. So if you administer THC in the lab, you robustly see these anxiety and psychotic-like effects that then dissipate after the experiment is finished. One of the other things is that both humans and non-human animals will self-administer THC, it's dependence-forming, and this is one of the major harms of cannabis use, is the dependence-forming effects of THC. Now looking to CBD, it's very contrasting to THC. CBD is not intoxicating at typical doses. You have to use a very, very high dose to get intoxicating effects, and that never happens with the doses that people consume in real life. One of the interesting things about CBD is that it could potentially reduce anxiety. There are some experimental studies showing this. And for psychosis, there are 2 positive clinical trials showing that CBD could reduce psychotic symptoms. So in terms of psychiatric drug development, CBD has been very interesting. Another field where it's been very interesting is severe childhood epilepsy syndromes. And in terms of addiction, there's some experimental and preclinical work showing that CBD could be anti-addictive. So very contrasting effects of THC and CBD overall. And when we think about cannabis, the most common form typically is herbal cannabis. And there are 2 main forms. So the seeded herbal cannabis is a very traditional form of cannabis. You don't see very much in Europe today. And this is typically outdoor grown. And it involves cannabis plants which include a combination of females and males. And so we're taking the flowers from the female plants. But what's happened is that the males have actually fertilized those female plants and produced seeds. As a result, when the female produces seeds, it produces less THC. So as a result, this seeded herbal cannabis has quite a low concentration of THC, approximately 6%. More common now is sensimilia, which in Spanish means without seeds. And so here we have the female plants separated from the males. This allows them to produce more THC, or CBD if that's a preferential cannabinoid. And other interventions such as indoor growing and UV light can increase the cannabinoid synthesis. And sensimilia is typically around 15% THC. It can get to around 20-25% THC as well, so much higher overall. Cannabis resin is very important for the European cannabis market. And there are many different ways you can make it, but essentially the most common is the sieving method. And here you have your herbal cannabis material. It's broken up. And what you want to do is to loosen those trichomes and get those trichomes. You want to keep the THC, but to lose the herbal plant material. So what you do is you get a very fine mesh, and this is just the right size such that the trichomes will fall through, and you'll collect them below. And the herbal cannabis material will stay on top. So you can see what happens. The trichome heads fall off from the body, and then they'll fall through your screen. And what you'll be left with is this loose material, which is sometimes called keef. These are just the trichomes on their own. And this is sometimes sold as a product by itself, but more commonly it's pressed. And when it's compressed, it can produce cannabis resin, which ranges quite a lot in THC concentrations, typically 5 to 20% THC. Over time, people have developed newer methods to extract trichomes, and there have been innovations here. One method is using a combination of cold water and agitation. And the reason this works is that it makes those trichomes very, very brittle. And so you have icy water and a food mixer here. This dislodges the trichomes, separates them in a more efficient way. But essentially, it follows the same process because you're using a sieve to separate out those trichomes from the plant material. This is called water hash or ice extraction. And what you're left with is a cannabis product that's much higher in THC concentration, so you might have around 30% THC using this method. And concentrates have been a very important part of legal markets in Washington state and other legal cannabis markets in the USA. One of the first and most widely known was butane hash oil. This is actually very easy but very dangerous to make at home. So what you need is essentially a glass tube. And within this glass tube, you can place your ground herbal cannabis and you pack it tight. And that's a starting point. You can then go to a store and buy a can of butane. There we go. And so you push the butane through. And what this does is it collects the trichomes, and then you can drain the material onto this tray below. And this contains a combination of the butane and the cannabinoids. So the next stage is to purge the solution, which removes, in theory, the butane. And then what you're left with finally is a very highly potent product such as shatter at around 80% THC. And there are three major concerns with this kind of product. The first is the obvious one in that you have a much higher concentration of THC and potentially a greater dose. The second is that you're using butane in a potentially dangerous illicit environment, and there's a big risk of explosion. And so where I'm from in the UK, there were a string of explosions in 2006, some involving death. And when you looked at the buildings that were used to make this, the whole buildings are blown apart. So this, at large scale, this can be a very, very dangerous process. And the final risk is that you do get residue solvent material. So when we use butane, there's a risk of inhaling residue solvent. When we produce medicinal products, we have very strict regulations for these residues, but actually, as you'd expect, when produced in an illicit environment, there's no regulation there, so there's a risk of these. Another thing is that with the concentrate process, you're extracting the cannabinoids directly from inside the cell. And so this is much more efficient than simply dislodging the cell, and this can explain why we see much higher concentrations for the concentrates when compared to the cannabis resin. Since then, there have been more innovations, especially in the USA, in terms of safer methods of extraction, one being CO2, that can produce similar concentrations using more sophisticated equipment. Another development has been rosin, which is a very interesting product because this is very easy to produce using only hair straighteners and parchment paper. So it's very easy to produce using household materials, and it's not a dangerous process. Essentially, it uses a combination of heat and pressure. And by doing so, you get a very efficient extraction process. This is a very valuable product in new legal markets because it can carry the distinctive taste and smell of herbal cannabis, which is often missing from cannabis resin. So rosin is potentially a new trend that might emerge further. And also distillation is taking things to the maximum in terms of almost 100% THC. And these products look very different because, in fact, they can be a clear crystal. And so when regulators find a seizure of this product, they think it might be crack cocaine or methamphetamine. In fact, it is THC, and this is a very rare product, but some vendors in the USA are selling these products now. Now, I presented an overview of lots of different products. This is a summary of changes in the USA based on seizures from Mahmoud El-Soli's lab in Mississippi. And so over the course of 10 years, we saw an increase from 9 to 17% THC across all of these products. If we break it down by product, there are, as you could expect, much higher concentrations for those concentrates. But overall, an increase in all cannabis products. And it's largely driven by an increase in the prevalence of sensimilia cannabis. And the other thing that happened was that the THC to CBD ratio rose considerably. So from 23 to 1 to 104 to 1. So the concentration of CBD wasn't very high to start with. It's getting even lower relative to THC. Okay, so I've given you a brief overview of the changes in cannabis products and in THC and CBD concentrations. Now I'm going to go into the health effects of these changes. This was a study we conducted in the UK some time ago. We were very interested in the use of these different products and sensimilia, which in the UK is often called skunk. And you often, across different countries, you have different names for these products, but I'm going to use the term sensimilia here. And in the UK at the time, this sensimilia was a high THC product. We also had seeded herbal cannabis, which has low THC, and we had hash or cannabis resin, which was low THC at that time in the UK. And we were very interested in how use of these different products affected the user. And so for this sample, we found people who had experience of using all three of these types in the last year. Because what you often find is that some people prefer to use a specific type, while others prefer a different type. And if you compare them, they might have other differences. And so we were really interested in people who used all three types and comparing their level of use. What you can see on this graph is people's choices when selecting which kind of cannabis had each of these attributes, which include a combination of negative effects, positive effects, and fairly neutral characteristics. So if we look at the high THC form, sensimilia, you can see unanimously this was the kind of cannabis that impaired people's memory the most, so over 80% for this. It also made them the most paranoid. So in terms of negative effects, the high THC form of cannabis was very, very pronounced. At the same time, these people said that it gave them the best high. It was also the most available and their preferred type. And so these data, I think, give perspective to the consumer in that they can recognize that a drug can have benefits as well as harms. And I think when we discuss cannabis with young people, it's important to recognize that there may be benefits and there may be harms, and understanding that and getting the balance right in terms of a message that can help them. So the real aim of this study was to look at dependency, and we used the Severity of Dependence scale, which is a standard screening instrument for looking at dependency to a range of drugs. And what we found was that the more days people used sensimilia every month, the more dependent they were. So there was a very clear relationship whereby increased use was related to increased dependency. But in fact, for the low THC forms of cannabis, we didn't see this relationship at all. So it doesn't matter for the low potency forms based on this study how much you use, you don't have that risk. But for the high THC form, you do have this increased risk with use. And the other important finding from this study was that younger people were more vulnerable. So the relationship between the high THC cannabis and dependency was stronger as age decreased. And this relates potentially to the role of the endocannabinoid system in neurodevelopment. So we know that adolescents may be especially vulnerable to the effects of cannabis, and so high THC forms particularly could be harmful during adolescence. So that was a cross-sectional study. But of course, cannabis has been changing over time, and we were very interested in these changes. So you can see these two panels show data from the EMCDDA, who monitor drug use across Europe. And you can see on the left, this was an analysis I did for EMCDDA based on concentrations of THC in cannabis resin. So you can see there's this dramatic increase in THC over time across Europe. And at the same time, when we're thinking about addiction, as we've heard from Anne Lynn's presentation earlier, there's been an increase in treatment seeking for cannabis problems. And you can see that on the right panel here. So these are all countries across Europe. We can see cannabis is shown in red, and treatment demand for cannabis is increased and actually superseded opioids as a primary reason for first-time treatment entrants. And so we were scratching our heads and thinking, hang on a sec, is there something happening here? Could it be that the increase in THC could be at least partially responsible for the increase in treatment seeking? And this was a hypothesis we were very interested in testing. So in order to do so, we found the highest quality monitoring data in the world, which is actually conducted in the Netherlands. The reason it's the highest quality is because they use randomized sampling from coffee shops. And there's a real advantage to this because when we look at cannabis seized from the police, we know that that happens in a biased way. So the kind of person who gets stopped and searched for their cannabis or the kind of person who gets intercepted at the border might not be a typical consumer. You might have larger quantities of cannabis, different profiles of users, and you might have more samples in particular regions in different years, so you don't have a really good estimate of the THC concentration. But what they've been doing at the Trimbos Institute is over 16 years, they've been visiting a random selection of coffee shops across the country and testing these cannabis products using this random method for THC concentrations. And in order to look at cannabis treatment, we use national treatment data, so all new cannabis submissions, first-time cannabis submissions presenting within this region during the same time period. And when we fit these two data sets together, what we saw was that in the Netherlands, there was quite an interesting profile of change, shown in red here, characterized by a rapid increase in THC between 2000 and 2004, followed by a subsequent decline, so then decreasing up to 2015. And we saw a very similar profile of change for the cannabis treatment data. So in terms of clinical treatment demand, there was a huge increase, and this also decreased after a short delay. This was best fit by a 5-year time lag, which is within the region of how THC might affect the trajectory from initial use to seeking treatment following severe dependency. Of course, these are observational data, and they do not apply cause and effect, but they are consistent with the hypothesis that THC increases could contribute to increased treatment demand. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to psychosis, which is a very controversial topic, especially in the UK, and I'm not sure what people's views are here. But I'll tell you about some recent data that we collected with colleagues at King's College London and across Europe and Brazil. So this was a study published earlier this year, and it looked at first episode psychosis and control patients across 11 sites in Europe and Brazil. So it was a very large and widespread study. It used a case control design to look at patterns of cannabis use in the first episode patients and the controls. And the main aim was to look at whether patterns of cannabis use were related to the risk of psychosis. We looked at patterns of daily use, so how frequently were people using, and also the kind of product used. So using data from the EMCDDA, we were able to look at THC concentrations in each of these countries. And then the second part was to look at population measures of cannabis use in controls and to see if these predicted the incidence of psychosis at these sites. So what you can see from this graph here is the risk of psychosis according to level of cannabis use. So on the y-axis, you can see this is the odds ratio, and right at the left, the odds ratio for never using cannabis is 1. So this is all relative to never use. So when this increases, it shows an increased risk of psychosis when compared to never using at all. And if you look at the graph, you can see that there are green bars and red bars. The difference between these is that the red bars were adjusted for several confounders. But you can see that overall, the estimates are quite similar to the green bars, so I don't suggest that you look at the difference between those in too much detail. The main message from this figure is that as the frequency and the potency increased, so did the risk of psychosis. And so you can see, if you were using cannabis rarely, you didn't experience an increased risk at all. So using cannabis rarely in terms of risk of psychosis was relatively safe according to the study. The real risk came among the daily users, as you heard from Jonathan Calkins' talk earlier. This is really the level of use that becomes problematic and that we should pay attention to. And so you can see the final two graphs on the right. The daily users who were using a lower potency cannabis actually had a relatively low risk of psychosis when compared to never users. But for those who used daily and above 10% THC, it was approximately 5-fold higher. So this suggests that increasing frequency and potency might confer greater risk of psychosis. And then the second part of this study was making use of these sites we had across Europe and Brazil and looking at the prevalence of high-potency cannabis use, shown here in green, shown in blue. And you can also see the adjusted incidence of psychosis across sites, shown in red. And what you can see is that there is a correlation between how frequently you see people using high-potency forms of cannabis across these sites and how many people come forward to first episode psychosis clinics with this disorder. So it's really the sites such as London, which is where I used to work, and Amsterdam and Paris. These are really the main risky areas in terms of both high prevalence of high-potency cannabis use and also the adjusted incidence of psychosis. Now, as I said, this is a very controversial topic, and it's an area of active debate. So in terms of causality, there has been some mixed evidence. Based on a study by Susie Gage, there is some evidence that cannabis initiation can cause psychosis risk, but also that the reverse could be true. So people who have a psychosis risk are more likely to initiate cannabis use. So with these data, it's important to bear that in mind. At the same time, if we're educating youth, the association is there, it's very strong, and so it's an important message to convey. So in the next part of the talk, I'm going to focus briefly on harm reduction and some excellent guidelines which have been developed by Benedict Fisher. So these came out of Canada, and they're officially endorsed by Health Canada, and I'm not sure if anyone's seen these before. But I recommend that you do look at them. So there are 10 recommendations which are evidence-based. These were based on a systematic review published in a prestigious journal, and they're neatly summarized in this table here. So these are the kind of recommendations you might give to young people. If they're abstinent, that's the ideal outcome. So the number one recommendation is that the best way to avoid the health consequences of cannabis is abstinence. That's what we should aim for. But if people do continue to use, they might reduce their harm by adopting some of these strategies. Whether or not they listen is another question, but these tools may be helpful for at least some individuals. Now, if we think about the kind of topics I've spoken about, one of the recommendations is to identify and choose lower risk products, and this specifically is products with a low THC concentration or low THC to CBD ratio. And another recommendation is to limit or reduce how much you use. But one thing that's missing from this is recommendations based on quantity of use. So, for example, where I'm from in the UK, the only kind of cannabis available is the high THC form. And so I might try to avoid that type of cannabis, but actually I can't. And so if I still wanted to use cannabis, how could I use that form of cannabis more safely? And that's something that's missing in these recommendations. If we think about alcohol harm reduction, there's a lot more progress in this field. It's not surprising. So these are some estimates I got. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So in Norway, as far as I could tell, the size of a standard unit was 12 grams. And recommendations were that men should have no more than 21 standard drinks per week, and for women, 14 standard drinks per week. These are quite similar to the UK guidelines we used to have. Now we've made men and women the same at 14 units. But here what we have is the size of a standard unit, which is established in grams. It's very precise. And we also have quantitative recommendations to say, if you're using alcohol within a week, this is approximately how much you should drink. Don't exceed that, otherwise you might be at risk of harm. With cannabis, we're not there yet. So one of the things that I've been trying to develop is the idea of a standard THC unit based on a fixed quantity of THC, which could, for example, be 5 milligrams of THC. And as you'll have heard from Jonathan's talk, this is the amount of cannabis that people used to consume a long time ago. Nowadays are consuming much more. As we've seen, cannabis products have changed remarkably, and there are many different products, as you can see here. The aim would be that a standard unit could apply across all of these products. But there are severe challenges with this. One is that it's very difficult to implement standard units in illicit markets. Another is that people administer cannabis in different ways. So we know that if you inhale cannabis, you have a very rapid onset of effects followed by rapid dissipation of effects. Whereas if people eat cannabis, which is very common now in certain regions, and for medicinal use as well. What we see there is a slower onset of effects and a slower dissipation. So very, very different in terms of the time effect profile. And another thing is that the cannabis plant, as I said, it contains many other cannabinoids, and it's not just a case of THC. So as the science progresses, we might see new developments in terms of ways to reduce harm. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about CBD. And this is really building on the idea that other aspects of the cannabis plant could be helpful for harm reduction or treatment. And these are data from a clinical trial that's just been completed, and it's not published yet. But I'm very excited to share these data with you today. So going back to cannabis and cannabinoids, it's possible the cannabis plant could contain both the cause of addiction in terms of THC, but also potentially a cure for addiction in terms of CBD and its anti-addiction effects alongside potential mental health benefits for anxiety and psychosis. One of the other things we've seen over the years is that CBD can influence the effect of THC. And this is a systematic review we recently published on experimental studies where we had a fixed concentration of THC administered. And then in one of those conditions, they received CBD. And we're saying, does CBD influence that effect? And having researched this area for many years, I can tell you that the findings are quite mixed. We've had some really encouraging findings, but not for all studies. But overall, the most common finding was that CBD reduced the effects of THC, so that there might be a role of CBD in terms of harm reduction potentially by reducing some of the negative effects. It doesn't tend to reduce intoxication, but it might reduce the psychotic-like effects and anxiety, and potentially having effects on emotion and reward. One of the studies that we did some time ago was looking at a specific cognitive process related to addiction. So my job, I can have interesting tasks to do as part of my job. One of those is to take pictures of drugs and then to take pictures of things that look like drugs but aren't drugs. So you can see here, this is a carefully controlled set of images. One contains cannabis and one contains some neutral items. And so the aim is that if somebody who doesn't use cannabis looks at these, they shouldn't be particularly interested in either of them. Somebody who uses cannabis on a daily basis, they will find their attention drawn to that cannabis image and they can't look away. And this is something we see across drugs of abuse. It's a very common process called attentional bias. And it's also related to those increased cognitions and craving related to a drug. People can't stop thinking about them. And in this task, we were measuring people's tendency to fixate on the cannabis images. And what we expect to see is that people who use cannabis daily, they show an attentional bias towards this cannabis cue. But what we were interested in is whether CBD might affect this typical process in the daily users. So what you can see here from the data is that people who had low CBD in their cannabis showed the typical attentional bias. This is shown in the left with the red bar. So they had an attentional bias greater than 0. So they were fixating on those cannabis images as we expect them to. But those people who had high CBD in their cannabis, they showed the opposite effect. They were actually looking away from the cannabis. They were looking towards the neutral cues, which might be indicative of some kind of treatment response. We also saw, looking at people's explicit ratings of how pleasant these cues were that the CBD cannabis made the images less explicitly pleasant. And this was a pilot study with some really exciting findings based on a small sample size, showing that CBD may reduce tobacco smoking. So on the left, you could see that people treated with placebo over the course of 1 week didn't reduce their tobacco smoking at all, but those treated with CBD showed a reduction in tobacco use. And we know that cannabis is very often co-administered with tobacco, especially in Europe. So this was important in terms of cannabis treatment. So we were really interested to test whether CBD could reduce cannabis use, but this was the first study to do this, and so we had very limited information about the dose. We know based on other fields such as anxiety, there's an inverted U-dose response curve whereby having a dose that's too low or too high will miss the effect, and you need to get the dose just right in the middle. So we tested a range of doses. So we used this adaptive design consisting of placebo and the 3 doses of CBD. 200, 400, and 800 milligrams. All people had a DSM-5 cannabis use disorder, and they all received motivational interviewing as part of this. So everyone received a psychological intervention. going to skip this section, but I'll let you know that the primary outcome was cannabis use measured by biological and self-report measures. So what we did at an early stage was that we showed that 200 milligrams was not going to be an effective dose for reducing cannabis use, so we dropped it, and we continued randomizing to placebo and the higher 2 doses of CBD. And our sample were predominantly in their mid-20s, male, and with a severe cannabis use disorder. We had a very high retention in treatment, 94% completed treatment. And what you can see here is that for urinary THC, there was a 45% reduction in cannabis use compared to placebo. And that's shown by a higher concentration of these dots in the placebo side of the graph when compared to THC. So overall, CBD reduced cannabis use according to urinary measures. We also saw a similar effect for 800 milligrams CBD. So all of these data points are moving away from that central line, showing reduced cannabis use in those treated with CBD at 800 milligrams. And in terms of days abstinent from cannabis, we saw the same profile. Here we wanted CBD to increase days abstinent, and we saw more days abstinent in the CBD group compared to placebo for 400 milligrams. So approximately 2.2 times more likely to be abstinent on a typical day when compared to placebo. And we saw a similar effect, slightly smaller for the 800 milligrams. Again, more likely to be abstinent on a typical day when compared to placebo. And I would go through these graphs in more time, but I'm aware that time is running out, so I'm going to skip through these. In terms of safety, we saw 94% of people completed treatment, no one dropped out due to the effects of CBD, and the rate of adverse events was low, with no severe adverse events. And in terms of secondary outcomes, we saw some benefits for cannabis withdrawal symptoms and for tobacco use. We actually saw poorer sleep quality in the CBD groups, which we think was due to the reduction in cannabis use and withdrawal in terms of sleep, and some benefits in terms of depression and anxiety. No changes in alcohol use. So in conclusion, high-potency cannabis products carry a greater risk of addiction and psychosis based on the data I presented. And lower risk guidelines currently encourage people who do continue to use cannabis to choose a lower THC or lower THC to CBD ratio product. In future, it may be that standard THC units could inform guidelines by providing quantitative recommendations. And importantly, if these units were used to inform pricing, so minimum unit pricing we know is very effective for reducing alcohol consumption, this could be a way, in combination with reduced availability, to reduce consumption in the heaviest consumers. CBD is another cannabinoid that shows really interesting medicinal effects. It's been shown to influence the effect of THC across some studies, and it may have potential for treating addiction and mental health disorders. In this preliminary study, we found that CBD was more effective than placebo at reducing cannabis use. So it may be that THC is the cause, and CBD could be a potential cure for some people in terms of cannabis use disorders. But this is a preliminary study, and it's a dose-finding trial, so further evidence is needed to inform these effect size estimates and to generate robust suggestions for what can be used in clinical practice. Thanks very much.